For the Jews who inhabited the Czech lands, so Bohemia, Moravia and Silesia, the 19th century was arguably the most important when it came to their emancipation into the rest of society. The December Constitution, which came into effect in 1867, had granted them complete and unconditional equality with all the other citizens of the Habsburg Empire, and many discriminatory and repressive laws that Jewish people had been subjected to for centuries suddenly vanished. What followed was a period where Jews could finally live wherever they wanted, work wherever they wanted, and live out their lives. A period of migration ensued immediately afterwards. Prague's Jewish community almost doubled in the second half of the 19th century, as Jews from the Czech-speaking areas of Bohemia flocked to the city. New Jewish communities were also established in the rapidly industrializing German-speaking border areas, where new opportunities awaited. As such, new centers of Jewish life appeared in cities like Reichenberg or Liberec, Karlsbad or Karlovy Vary, Tetschen or Děčín, Rux or Most, and many more. Whereas the Jews who remained in the countryside were largely rooted in their village and were proud of maintaining their Jewish identity, many Jews who moved into the cities chose a different path, and a process of gradual secularization and assimilation into the surrounding Czech or German cultures could be witnessed. Jews in Prague, for instance, were often jokingly called 4-day Jews, as many of them only visited the synagogue during the 3 high holy days and to celebrate Kaiser Franz Josef's birthday. One big reason for this process is that even in towns and cities with a relatively high Jewish population, many Jews were still only a tiny minority. As a result, many Jews started to identify themselves first and foremost with the Czech or German nations, and their Jewish faith faded into the background. The number of Jews noticeably decreased in the years leading up to World War I, and yet in the first few decades following emancipation, the history of Jews in the Czech lands seemed to be a success story. In the late 1800s, however, things took a turn for the worse for the Czech Jews. Just like in Germany, Austria, France, and many other countries, anti-Semitic resentments began to emerge. The reasons for this are obviously very complicated and convoluted, but in short it was a mixture between the following factors. The rise of laissez-faire capitalism with very little government intervention and the subsequent economic boom did not just leave victors behind. Especially middle-class artisans and salespeople increasingly struggled to compete with the new factories and department stores and saw their livelihood in danger. Furthermore, a small number of people got filthy rich with speculation, while others had to live in cramped flats with very little money to spend. As Jewish people were often associated with the banking sector and capitalism, this economic disparity unfortunately became a breeding ground for anti-Jewish agitation. At the same time, social Darwinist ideas also became very popular, and Judaism was no longer seen as a religion but as a race, which competed with all the others in a supposed constant battle for survival, and was therefore inherently opposed to the Czech, German, French nations. Countless anti-Semitic pamphlets were published all over Europe, such as La France Juive by Édouard Rumont, Der Talmud-Jude by August Rohling, and Die Judenfrage als Rassen-, Sitten- und Kulturfrage by Eugen Düring, just to name a few. In the Czech lands, another factor also contributed to the rise of anti-Judaism: nationalism. In the late 19th century, prominent Czech nationalists began to demand greater autonomy for the Czech lands and that Czech should replace German as the dominant language in the region. This put them into conflict with the German-speaking minority in the cities and border regions, which mostly preferred to keep the status quo. In this environment, Jews often became the target of Czech nationalists, as they often spoke German in everyday life, and thus were accused of being sympathetic to the Habsburg Empire and hindering the economic and political development of the Czech nation. Under the slogan "Svůj k svému," or each to his own, Jewish shops were boycotted in order to create a stronger Czech middle class. The first Czech to attempt to form an anti-Semitic organization was Jaromír Houšek, a close friend of Ernst Schneider, an infamous anti-Semite in the Imperial Council. Houšek was also the publisher of České zájmy, in which he published countless slanderous anti-Jewish articles. Gradually, anti-Semitism was also used as a political tool to gather more votes in a time where the electoral bases of the Habsburg Empire just recently increased to encompass everyone that paid more than 5 gulden per year in taxes. One culprit that pursued this questionable strategy was the National Liberal Party, also known as the Young Czechs. The party had split off from the Czech National Party in 1874, followed a much more nationalistic and aggressive course, and predominantly appealed to the lower classes. As time went on, a strongly anti-Semitic wing emerged within the party, represented by Václav Březnovský, who would later become a member of the Bohemian Diet and even of the Imperial Council in Vienna. Increasingly, the Young Czechs used anti-Semitic slogans to garner support among their voter base and exploited nationalistic and anti-German sentiments to their advantage. The radical wing would eventually lose its influence after a party conference in Nymburk in 1894, where it was decided that the party should show a bit more restraint in general in the face of poor election results. The Young Czechs would slip into irrelevance soon after, but the damage was already done. Another element that spread political anti-Semitism was the Czech Christian Social Party. As was the case with Karl Lueger and his Christian Socials in Vienna, anti-Semitism became a core part of their ideology. The Christian Social Party spread countless conspiracy theories about how the Jews were secretly controlling the strings behind the scenes, with the goal of abolishing the Christian society and leading Europe to a secular, liberal future. Another conspiracy theory that was often spread in the first half of the 1890s was the legend of the blood libel or the ritual murder. According to this legend, Jews required the blood of innocent Christian boys and girls for various religious, medical, or magical reasons. The origin of this absolutely mental fairy tale can be found in 12th century Norwich, from where it spread to other parts of Europe and caused a wave of anti-Jewish violence. In medieval times, the legend claimed that the Jews used the blood to bake matzah and remove the horns that all Jewish children are supposedly born with. In the 19th century, the focus shifted away somewhat and the legend adopted a much more sexual notion, claiming that Jews mostly target young women to desecrate their blood. Until World War I, hundreds of public accusations of ritual murder were made, and some of them even ended in sensationalist public trials, such as in Kutaisi in 1879, in Tisza between 1882 and 1883, on Corfu in 1891, and in Xanten between 1891 and 1892, just to name a few. In the Czech lands, accusations of ritual murder often ended in violent riots, such as in 1892, when a Christian servant girl was murdered near Jungbundslau, Mlada Boleslav, or in 1893, when the body of another young Christian woman was found in the river Elbe near Kolin. The blood libel legend was very convenient for people living in small Czech towns. It allowed them to simply ignore the prospect that there might be a murderer living among their community and make them feel safer by putting the blame on someone else completely. It also made it possible to sweep the problem of suicide among young women under the carpet. When it came to persecuting the rioters, it was often argued that the Jews had brought the violence on themselves for supporting the German national cause. For instance, the medical officer who examined the body of the dead girl in Kolin claimed that all of the violence could have been avoided had the Jewish community simply stopped maintaining a German primary school in the town. Further riots broke out in 1897 when Minister-President Kazimierz Badeni resigned after failing to implement his controversial language reform, which would have required civil servants in the Czech lands to speak both Czech and German, regardless of the majority language in their respective administrative region. This further sparked ethnic tensions, and shortly after Badeni's departure, violent clashes broke out in Prague between German and Czech nationalists. After a crowd of angry Czechs pelted the new German theatre with stones, they continued their attacks on synagogues in the districts of Královské Vinohrady, Žižkov and Smíchov. The violence also spread to other Czech towns and could only be stopped after the Austrian government declared martial law. Surprisingly, nobody died during those days. Still, it was a sign to the Jewish community in Bohemia that they were no longer safe and that the Czech nationalist movement was not going to accept them as part of their own. Only a few months later, the Bohemian Jews were struck by one of the biggest political and judicial scandals in the history of the Habsburg Empire, and it all began with a horrific murder. On the 1st of April, 1899, the body of 19-year-old Agnieszka Hrusová was found in a forest near the small town of Polna. She had been on her way to work from her home village of Mala Wierznice and was attacked on the way to Polna. According to the report written by a local judicial commission, Agnieszka's body showed clear signs of a violent struggle. Her head had been brutally hit multiple times, her throat had been slit, her clothes were found strewn about and covered in blood, and the body had been covered with a number of pine twigs in an attempt to hide it. This was most definitely the result of a violent, sexually motivated crime. Very quickly, a young, unemployed and intellectually impaired Jewish cobbler by the name of Leopold Hilsner was accused of murdering Agnieszka Chruzowa. He wasn't exactly well liked in the town and had the reputation of being a good-for-nothing vagabond. But still, there were absolutely no signs that he could have been the murderer, and he was absolutely only targeted because he was Jewish. Hilsner lived with his mother in the Jewish quarter of Polna, close to where Agnieszka worked before her death. To understand why Hilsner was targeted in particular, we have to take a look at the situation of the Jewish community in Polna as a whole. Polna was a small town of about 5,000 people, of whom a bit more than 200 were Jews. Even after the dissolution of the ghetto, most of them still resided in the Jewish quarter, under desolate conditions. Over the course of the late 1800s, their number had actually been decreasing as the growing hatred against Jews forced many to leave. You see, Polna was situated just outside the German-speaking exclave of Iglau, or Jihlava, which meant that disputes over the use of everyday language were much more present than elsewhere. The Jews in Polna spoke partly Czech and partly German. Many were even bilingual and were thus under constant suspicion of the Czech-speaking townspeople for allegedly sympathizing with the Germanizers or conspiring against the Czech nations as a whole. Many anti-Semites took issue with the Jewish German school, which coincidentally was located in the same house that Hilsner lived in, claiming that it was simply a waste of taxpayers' money. So ultimately, it was a series of unfortunate circumstances combined with the general disdain that many people felt towards Hilsner, which eventually led to him becoming the prime suspect. He had no alibi to prove that he wasn't near the crime scene at the time of the murder, but there was also no indication that he had been nearby. A witness who claimed to have seen the murderer shortly before Agnieszka's death didn't recognize Hilsner as the man she had seen on that day. Unfortunately for Hilsner, the authorities of Polna were not interested in carrying out a thorough and fair investigation, and instead just wanted to frame him as the murderer. Rumors quickly spread that Hilsner had allegedly committed a ritual murder. In 1899, the traditional Jewish Passover celebration ended just one day after Agnieszka's body had been found. This led many townspeople to believe that her blood had been needed by the Jews living in Polna to make the matzah eaten during their celebration. The rumor was further spread by anti-Semitic agitators and newspapers. Influenced by these fairy tales, an unofficial committee on legal affairs was formed with the blessing of the local mayor to push the idea that the young Agnieszka had indeed been killed as part of a ritual murder. Some notable members of the committee include Jaromir Huszek and Hans Arnold Schwer, editor at the anti-Semitic Viennese newspaper Deutsches Volksblatt. The members of the committee conducted a number of interviews with witnesses and heavily tweaked the testimonies to fit their preconceived ideas. The Polna authorities were absolutely convinced by Hilsner's guilt, and even the state prosecutor Josef Antonin Schneider-Swoboda from Kuttenberg or Kutna seems to have preferred the ritual murder explanation. What convinced them so staunchly was probably the sloppy abduction report on Agnieszka's body written by two doctors from Polna. They claimed that no blood could be found in the body, which led to many people drawing the conclusion that someone must have extracted it. Many dubious witness testimonies began to be published in the next few months, most of them claiming that they had seen Hilsner with his accomplices walking towards the forest, where Agnieszka would later be found. One such testimony, which claimed to have recognized Hilsner near the edge of the woods from a distance of more than 700 meters away purely by the characteristic way with which he held his cane, was finally enough to bring Hilsner before court. By that point, the news of the alleged ritual murder had long left the realm of local newspapers and made their way across the Habsburg Empire. The Deutsches Volksblatt in Vienna was one of the most influential voices which tried to claim that Agnieszka Chruzowa had been killed because of her blood. In April of 1899 it wrote, The examination revealed that the blood vessels contained no blood, that the unfortunate victim of the murderous fellow had bled to death under the hands of the murderer, but the amount of blood spilled could neither be found nor proven anywhere. The blood must therefore have been collected. Finally, in September 1899, a trial was held at the district court in Kottenberg, and it quickly became a public spectacle. Many major newspapers sent their journalists to report on what was happening. The not exactly likeable Hilsner had very little chance of getting out of this unscathed, as public opinion was very much against him, and the ritual murder theory was uncritically accepted by the state prosecutor, Josef Antonin Schneider-Swoboda. The man who was most responsible for stirring up anti-Semitic emotions during the trial was the lawyer of Agnieszka's mother, Karel Baksa. Baksa had studied at the Charles University in Prague and later worked at the district courts of Tabor, Iga or Cheb, and Prague. A few years later, he would become a member of the Imperial Council, and after the end of World War I, even the mayor of Prague for almost 20 years. Without ever explicitly mentioning the word ritual murder, he purposefully redirected the court procedures towards accepting the possibility that Hilsner killed Agnieszka for her blood together with two accomplices. For example, he frequently brought up the matter of the missing blood when questioning Alois Prokes, one of the doctors who wrote the dubious autopsy report. But that no blood was found, not even at the crime scene. What could have happened to the blood? I can't say. I understand that, but you said that the blood would have to splatter a lot and that the whole ground would have to be covered with it. Was there as much blood in the place where Hrušová was found as a human being must have? Absolutely not that much. There should have been 4 to 5 kilos of blood. What would the place have looked like if the murderers had let Hrušová bleed to death there? There should have been a huge pool of blood in this place. Do you admit that the blood was collected with something? Please speak up. I'll concede to that. During his final speech, he even went so far as to suggest that Polna's entire Jewish community was complicit in the murder. He, Hilsner, and 2 other people wanted to draw as much blood as possible from this girl, this Christian virgin. This synagogue is the starting point and also the end point of the Polna murder. No blood was found. That says it all. No murderer wants the blood to be saved. No one else wants the blood to be saved for him, but this murderer needed the blood. That is why, in the judgment of the experts, the blood was not found. Only foreign Jews came to the town, who learned from Hilsner that there was a Christian woman here who could be slaughtered. I speak here with a clear conscience, and you will also act with a clear conscience if you condemn Hilsner. I declare with full conviction that Hilsner is guilty, and you too, my honourable jurors, certainly have this conviction, and therefore you will find Leopold Hilsner guilty. Baksa received thunderous applause for his, quite frankly, ridiculous speeches. Despite the fact that there was neither irrefutable proof of Hilsner's guilt, nor even of a ritual murder having taken place, Hilsner was found guilty by all 20 members of the jury and sentenced to death. Due to the massive amount of pressure that he was surrounded from, Hilsner admitted to having killed Agnieszka and even named his 2 alleged accomplices. Both of them had an alibi, however, and Hilsner soon retracted his statement. Hilsner's conviction hit the Habsburg Empire like a bombshell and deeply divided the population into 2 different factions. Those who believed that a ritual murder had taken place in Polna, and those who didn't. One member of the former was the prominent Viennese Christian social politician, Hermann Bielolawek, who held a rousing speech in the Musikverein building. You have all read the details of the gruesome murder. For us, it is a question of whether or not there is proof that there are fanatical Jews who procure Christian blood for ritual or other purposes, namely by murder. There are fanatics in all religions, more or less dangerous, and this could also be assumed of Judaism. But the fact that the whole of Jewry, including its press, immediately declares its solidarity in favor of a murderer because he is a Jew, proves that all Jews are immediately prepared to betray all forms of justice, even when it comes to the most horrific and vile crime, if it is a matter of fellow believers. Others were horrified when they heard the news from the Kottenberg trial. The Neue Freie Presse, one of the most widely read newspapers at the time, which mostly appealed to the educated liberal bourgeoisie, wrote, "But the fact that a jury box, a court, a whole city and its surroundings are literally judging under the hypnosis of a legend from the Dark Age is shameful for our time, for our education and civilization. The Arbeiter-Zeitung, the organ of the Austrian Social Democratic Party, was equally appalled. Nevertheless, the murder of poor Rosa would probably have remained just a strange criminal case if the greedy anti-Semites had not been eager for the opportunity to prove their insane blood-tail superstition with the murder in Polna. This is what the whole trial was about, and it is this aspect that makes it a monument to a lack of culture. Who would ever have believed that at the end of this century this wicked fable would be resurrected, this ridiculous delusion against which even the Middle Ages fought back? The debates surrounding the murder of Polna are a very good reflection of just how hostile life had become for the Jewish citizens in the Habsburg Empire. In Bohemia, they were met with contempt from both the Czech and the German nationalist movement. The hope that the Jewish emancipation of 1867 would finally solve the Jewish question and that the slow but certain assimilation into the surrounding cultures would make them more accepted by their contemporaries evaporated into thin air. One person who was of the opinion that the Jewish integration into German, Czech, Hungarian or Polish culture was futile was the Viennese rabbi Josef Samuel Bloch. Bloch argued that the Jews should defend themselves against anti-Semitism by fully embracing their Jewish identity, working together and combating anti-Semitic agitation with rational and scientific arguments. He had gained fame in 1883 when he publicly humiliated August Rohling, a theology professor at the University of Prague. Rohling had claimed that the Talmud dictated Jews to sacrifice Christians for their blood. Bloch managed to prove that Rohling couldn't form a single sentence in Hebrew and was thus unable to even understand what is written in the Talmud. During the Hilsner Affair, Bloch partially blamed the Jews for this debacle, claiming that they had by no means put as much effort into combating the ritual murder legends as the enemies of Judaism had put into its malicious dissemination. Bloch put in a lot of effort to rationally prove that the ritual murder legend was just that, a legend. He showed that since the medieval ages there were countless occasions of Christians committing murders, only to then blame them on the Jews. He also showed that all the previous alleged ritual murders in Hungary or Germany proved to be completely untrue. But how could it possibly be that a medieval legend managed to captivate the modern, enlightened and progressive Habsburg society? The most prominent anti-Semites of the time realized that news of a ritual murder always captivated the public and used it to further spread anti-Semitic thinking, which allowed them to gather more support among the populace. The anti-Semitic parties, most prominently the Christian Socials, shamelessly exploited the sense of uncertainty that prevailed among the voting populace since the financial crisis of 1873 for their own gain. Anti-Semitic agitators used the ritual murder legend as part of their narrative to paint the Jewish citizens of the empire as an inherently hostile element that could not be reasoned or even bargained with. Furthermore, in the modern press landscape, the newspapers reported on the murders, the court processes, the witnesses, the rumors for weeks on end. As is the case today, the public loves sensationalist scandals, which further encouraged the less dignified newspapers to exploit the murderers to sell more copies. Just when it seemed like a superstitious belief had completely triumphed over Austrian rule of law, a man called Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk decided to intervene. Masaryk came from a humble background, being born in 1850 in southern Moravia as the son of a carriage driver and a cook. Still, he managed to have quite an impressive academic career. After having attended high school in Brno and later Vienna, he studied philosophy at the universities of Vienna and Leipzig, finally habilitating in 1878. For a few years he worked as a lecturer in Vienna before getting a position as a philosophy professor at the Czech University of Prague. He quickly became one of the leading voices of the Czech national movement, joined the Young Czech Party, and even served as a member of parliament in the Imperial Council between 1891 and 1893. Masaryk's relationship with Jewish people was ambivalent. During his childhood he had been told the ritual murder legend by his mother and his priest. Initially he believed in it, going so far as to avoid Jews entirely. During his education, however, he realized that the horror stories were fabricated, and he began to establish contact with many Jews. For instance, one of his teachers was the philosopher and historian of Jewish descent, Theodor Gomperz, whose son Harry he would eventually become the tutor of. Still, he held onto the belief that Jews in the Czech lands were a completely different people than the Christian Czechs, even if they spoke the same language. Ultimately, he wouldn't intervene in the Hilsner Affair because of a sense of sympathy or even pity. In Masaryk's eyes, Hilsner was a useless scoundrel who deserved to go to prison. Instead, he challenged the results of the Kuttenberg trial in order to defend Christians from superstition. Later, he would confess that he stood up for Hilsner out of a sense of humanity, and because the widespread belief in the ritual murder legend cast a shame on the Czech people. Further, he saw political anti-Semitism as a distraction from the Czech national struggle for more self-determination. He pointed out the fact that the Czech nationalists and radicals suddenly began to sympathize with German anti-Semites and saw the Christian socials under Karl Lueger as a role model to follow. After some encouragement from one of his former students, Sigmund Münz, who worked as a political editor at the Neue Freie Presse, Masaryk involved himself in the Hilsner debate. He immediately got to work. He visited the crime scene, thoroughly read the autopsy report, and compared it to witness testimonies. Just a few weeks after Hilsner had been found guilty, Masaryk published his short pamphlet called The Need to Review the Polnar Trial, in which he heavily criticized the investigation, the autopsy, and the trial. Unfortunately, it was confiscated by Austrian authorities mere days after the publication. Shortly after, however, a left-liberal politician called Ferdinand Kronawetter read the contents of the entire pamphlet aloud during a session of the Imperial Council, and Masaryk's arguments were printed in newspapers all over Austria. In his pamphlet, Masaryk argued that the murder could have happened elsewhere and not in the forest where Agnieszka's body had been found. She had been dragged there hours after her death, which would explain the weird position her body was found in and the lack of blood on the ground. He also pointed out that Agnieszka's throat had been stabbed, not sliced. He criticized the prosecutors who dismissed the possibility of a sexually motivated crime way too quickly. And, after all, if someone had really wanted to carry out a ritual murder, they would have done everything in their power to make sure their crime remained undetected, and not ambush a random woman near a frequently visited forest during the day, only to then cover the body with some twigs in a half-assed attempt to hide it. Masaryk condemned the fact that the whole process surrounding the Polnar murder took place under anti-Semitic high pressure and its superstitious belief in ritual murders. Masaryk didn't stop there, however, and published a much longer pamphlet in the next year called The Meaning of the Polnar Crime for the Ritual Murder Superstition, in which he published all the results of his investigation. He had learned his lesson and published it in Berlin in order to circumvent Austrian censorship. With his brochure, he finally wanted to debunk the blood libel as a nonsensical myth and appeal to reason. In his foreword he wrote, "The anti-Semites see in the Polnar crime the strongest confirmation of the belief in ritual murder. This has moved me to examine the Polnar affair more carefully from all sides, and the result of this examination is, the Polnar crime is not a ritual murder. On the contrary, it is a striking proof of the fact that the ritual murder accusation is, in the fullest sense of the word, a superstition." Because of his dedication to the cause, Masaryk was quickly denounced as a traitor to the Czech people by radical Czech nationalists. This went so far that he was assaulted by a mob of angry university students when he tried to halt his lectures. In the end, the university put him on a compulsory leave. Still, Masaryk's commitment was not in vain. The medical faculty of Prague's Czech University started their own investigation and came to the conclusion that Masaryk's criticism of the abduction report and the forensic procedure was absolutely valid. Due to the ever-growing pressure, the Court of Appeals in Vienna annulled the court ruling of Kuttenberg and ordered a retrial. This time, however, the motive of ritual murder should be completely ruled out, thus supposedly guaranteeing a fair trial for Hilsner. The second trial took place in October 1900 in the picturesque town of Písek. Unfortunately for Hilsner, the anti-Semitic atmosphere hadn't died down. Much of the Czech population was still convinced that he had killed Agnieszka Hruzová for her blood, and Karel Baxa was still the lawyer of the victim's family. In the end, Hilsner was once again found guilty and sentenced to death. But this time he was also convicted of being an accomplice in a similar murder case that happened near Polnar 1 year before Agnieszka's murder. So ultimately the jury still believed that Hilsner had committed a ritual murder, even if he wasn't specifically accused of it. Once again, the ruling was appealed but ultimately rejected. At the very least, the Court of Appeals ruled that the murder of Pollner had been committed under a sexual motive, and shortly after, Hilsner's death sentence was converted to life in prison. While Masaryk might have succeeded in getting a lighter sentence for Hilsner, he ultimately failed in his principal goal, ridding the Czech nation of the ridiculous belief in the ritual murder and getting a fair second trial. As is demonstrated by this cover of the anti-Semitic magazine Šípy, depicting the people of Prague eagerly reading the news surrounding the Hilsner Affair, the matter deeply captivated the Czech public. It is of course impossible to say exactly to what extent the ritual murder legend was accepted as a fact by the people in the Czech lands, but what can be said for certain is that the murder of Pollner agitated large parts of society. Especially those people who already followed a nationalistic and anti-Semitic ideal were quick to believe that an innocent Christian woman had been killed by a Jew for nothing but her blood. Countless anti-Jewish pamphlets, postcards and songs were published at the time. Agnieszka was celebrated as a martyr, and her positive Christian attributes such as virtue, obedience and fear of God were highlighted. This supposed picture of her was spread far and wide, and her face became ingrained in many people's memories. This is definitely not her, however, as no pictures have ever been taken of Agnieszka. This shows that scammers were more than willing to exploit her murder for financial gain. The motive of Hilsner hanging from the gallows also became very popular. In September 1899, the district governor of Kolín reported that countless posters had suddenly appeared overnight, depicting Hilsner on the gallows. In 1901, so shortly after the trial in Písek, a Jew in Pollner woke up and, to his shock, discovered a straw doll hanging on his house with a sign saying, "This is what you get for the blood." In many ways, the Hilsner Affair can be seen as an Austrian version of the Dreyfus Affair. Both affairs happened almost simultaneously, with the Hilsner Affair starting just when the Dreyfus Affair was coming to an end. For those of you who are not too familiar with the Dreyfus Affair, here is a very concise summary. In 1894, the only Jewish artillery captain, Alfred Dreyfus, was accused by the French military of having supplied Germany with important military documents. There was no indication that he had actually done such a thing. Instead, he was only targeted because of the fact that he was a Jew and an Alsatian, which in the eyes of many army officers meant that he was a natural enemy of the French nation. Following an unjust trial, Dreyfus was dishonorably demoted and banished to Devil's Island for life. 1.5 years later, the leader of the External Military Intelligence Agency, Georges Picquart, found out that it was in fact a major called Marie-Charles Ferdinand Valsin-Esterhazy who had sent the documents. But instead of pardoning Dreyfus, Picquart was sent to Algeria, and Valsin-Esterhazy was declared to be innocent. Faced with this injustice, the famous author Émile Zola published an open letter to the French president with the title J'accuse, I accuse. In it, he denounced the corrupt military, the sloppiness of the military court, called out all those responsible by their name, and criticized the newspapers who had spread anti-Semitic clichés. For a while, the French public became split into two irreconcilable camps. One camp, the pro-Dreyfusard, believed in Dreyfus's innocence, while the other camp, the anti-Dreyfusard, was fully convinced of his guilt. Only when Valsin-Esterhazy publicly confessed that he was in fact guilty was Dreyfus allowed to return to France, where a second trial was held. And for a second time, he was found guilty of treason. Due to domestic and international outrage, the French president Émile Loubet pardoned Dreyfus in September 1899. It would, however, still take 7 years until Dreyfus was finally rehabilitated. Many parallels between the Hilsner and the Dreyfus affair become apparent. In both cases, a Jewish person was accused of a crime he hadn't committed just because of the fact that he was Jewish. Both were found guilty as a result of a flawed and deeply corrupt judicial system. Anti-Semitic clichés of the traitorous or bloodthirsty Jew were decisive in convicting both Hilsner and Dreyfus. These societal defects were challenged by two charismatic and sharp historical figures, Émile Zola in France and Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk in Austria. Both cases brought to light the deep-rooted anti-Semitism that had been brewing in both societies for decades, despite the Jewish emancipation. In both the Hilsner and Dreyfus affairs, The press played a huge role in stirring up anti-Jewish sentiments, while some newspapers stood up for justice and reason. But what was the aftermath of the Hilsner Affair? During World War I, Hilsner was pardoned as part of a general political amnesty by Kaiser Karl I and allowed to leave prison. He changed his name to Heller and spent the rest of his life in Vienna, Prague and Polna. He died in Vienna in 1928 and was buried at the Central Cemetery. In 2002, a memorial plaque was set up at Hilsner's former house in Vienna. In 2008, then Justice Minister Maria Berger held a ceremony at Hilsner's grave, adding the following words to the gravestone: "We regret the misconduct of the justice system. They are a warning to us for the future." Berger, in a speech, further said, "The injustice done to Leopold Hilsner can no longer be righted. Today's act of remembrance, in conjunction with the addition of the grave inscription, is therefore primarily of symbolic significance." To this day, Hilsner was never officially rehabilitated. A symbolic stone grave is located at the spot where Agnieszka was found. Next to it, you can find a plaque dedicated to her, accompanied by an image of the Virgin Mary. Agnieszka's actual grave looks like this and was erected at the cemetery of Polna. Tomáš Masaryk continued to be active in politics and founded the Czech Progressive Party. After he had been denounced by the other Czech nationalist parties for supporting Hilsner, he had decided to form his own, more progressive party and pursue more autonomy and self-determination for the Czech lands. During World War I, he taught in London and successfully lobbied for the creation of a Czechoslovak state, and would eventually become its first president. His role during the Hilsner Affair ensured his far-ranging popularity among Jews from all over the world and solidified his reputation of being a reasonable and trustworthy humanist. This greatly helped him in getting American support for the creation of a Czechoslovak state. As he himself wrote in a letter to Edvard Beneš, another prominent Czech nationalist, "Hilsner has been of great help to us now. Zionists and other Jews have openly accepted our program. American Jews also urged him to recognize Jewish as a nationality in Czechoslovakia, something which Masaryk happily followed up on. He had no sympathy towards the Jewish assimilationist movement. Instead, Jews in Czechoslovakia should develop their own unique national character, separate from the Czechs or the Germans." The violence and hatred he had witnessed against Jews during the Hilsner Affair, even against those who were perfectly assimilated, probably only strengthened his conviction. His support for the Jewish nationalists was very controversial among the Czech Jews. On the one hand, the Jewish Council under Max Brod and Ludwig Singer wrote a memorandum to the Czechoslovak National Assembly, requesting legal recognition of the Jewish national identity. On the other hand, the writer Otakar Gut wrote in a personal letter to Masaryk, "The Zionists belabor us Czech Jews, in your name and on your authority. It is said you sympathize with them, not with us. I don't know how much of that is true, but I feel that my Czechness is such an essential part of my being that no power on earth could take it away from me." In the end, and partially because of Masaryk's influence, the Czechoslovak Constitution of 1920 allowed Jews to select Jewish nationality in case of a nationwide census, regardless of their mother tongue. In many ways, the Hilsner Affair was nothing short of horrible and brought out the worst in humanity. Hilsner, an innocent Jew, got accused of a crime he hadn't committed and had to rot away in prison for 20 years. He was essentially a broken man with a ruined reputation when he was finally released. The identity of the actual murderer has never been determined, and probably never will be. Maybe he got punished for a later crime he committed, or maybe he never had to face any consequences. But the whole ordeal must have been particularly painful for Agnieszka's relatives. Their daughter, sister, or best friend got killed in the most brutal way just because some sadistic man wanted to live out his sexual fantasies, only for them to then get swarmed by a bunch of unscrupulous anti-Semites who were going to exploit Agnieszka's death to spread their own hateful ideology. They made up some story about a ritual murder, made Agnieszka a martyr, and completely corrupted the judicial process. Agnieszka, despite having her name being plastered all over Bohemia, and despite having got widespread declarations of more or less upright sympathy, never got any justice. Alrighty, dankeschön for watching, and hopefully you learned something useful. I am very sorry for the relatively long break, but it turns out that writing a bachelor's thesis takes a lot of time. Anyway, if you liked the video, a like and a subscribe would be well appreciated. A special and heartfelt thanks goes out to my very generous supporters on Ko-Fi. A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Philipp Machewka, Marius Gerling, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drohle, Wienweh, Pseudo-Riser, Lyle Furphy, and Yin. You are all bloody fantastic. Have a very nice day and see you next time.